Hi, welcome everyone. I think we're starting. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law weekly seminar. Today we're joined by Kate Casey, an associate professor of political economy at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, right across the street. Her research explores the interactions between economic and political forces in developing countries, with a particular interest in the role of information in enhancing political accountability and the influence of foreign aid on economic development. Her work has appeared in the American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and Quarterly Journal of Economics, among others, and she teaches a course in the MBA program focused on firm strategy vis-a-vis government in emerging markets. Today we'll be discussing some of her new research. Thank you, Kate.
Great. All right, thank you so much. Thanks for being here in person and online and for the opportunity to share some new, relatively new research. So yeah, the kind of big picture box that this fits in is sort of development economics meets political economy. And so we're kind of interested in the idea of, what sort of strategies are effective in enhancing electoral democracy in low income countries, and in particular, what's the potential role of information? So providing reliable information to voters and trying to strengthen electoral accountability. And then in particular, we're interested in if you have actually an intervention, information-based intervention that's been proven to be quite effective, what is the path from the kind of small-scale pilot to a large-scale, domestically owned nationwide information campaign? And what are the opportunities and constraints in making that transition? Yeah, so, does this,
well, when I tested it, it worked.
Well, maybe if you touch
I need to
the screen with the mouse.
Now try.
Yeah. Yay! Okay, so the paper is scaling political information campaigns, and this is joint work with Rachel Glenister, who is at the University of Chicago. So yeah, so to give a little bit more of the big picture motivation, when you kind of scan a bunch of low-income countries in various regions of the world, many of them seem to be kind of stuck in this low information, low accountability trap. So, a lot of these have relatively recently transitioned to multi-party democracy. So you can think about, they're having free and fair elections, but this kind of connection between electoral democracy and accountability and government performance is fairly weak, or remains pretty tenuous. And one of the things you can think about is, what information do voters have, right? So if voters don't have very good information about government, like what are the roles and responsibilities of elected officials, how much budget do they control, what does their performance look like? It's kind of hard for an election to, vote out the bad performers and retain the good ones if voters don't have the information to tell which is which, right? So who's doing a good job and who's not. And so if that's true, then voting is not creating this accountability pressure on elected officials. So the question is, how can you move from that trap into like a new situation where voters have good information, they make informed choices, and this creates accountability pressure that elected officials feel to perform better in office. So one, there's building evidence that providing information to voters could be a tool in this kind of transition to a higher accountability equilibrium. So, not all information interventions work, but there's some pretty rigorous evidence on things like providing voters with information from audits in Brazil or report cards on candidates from India. We're going to be focusing on debates between candidates from different parties for public debates in parliamentary elections. And so there's some evidence that there's some tools that are effective and could be, if they're at scale, might sort of shift things, be a big shock to the system that could change things up. A challenge, however, is that many of these studies are based on pretty tightly controlled, heavily resourced pilots, right? So it's a demonstration project, right? I'm going to proof of concept, this works. And then the question is, how do you move from that to a nationwide, domestically owned information campaign, right? And so you can think about a few things have to happen for such a transition to occur. So candidates have to be willing to supply information, right? They have to be willing to participate in something that they know is going to give very good information to voters. Voters need to some extent be willing to pay for information, right? You can just think about even traveling to a more central location to access information. You got to find some financially sustainable dissemination model. So if you know, the donors are pretty involved in these demonstration projects. So if the donor money is coming out, the domestic government is taking over, you got to have a pretty low cost way to get this information to voters at scale. And then finally, this has to work at scale in the same kind of way it worked in the controlled pilot, right? And there's a bunch of reasons to be concerned that when you take something and you scale it up, things are going to kind of fall down in sort of the capacity and implementation regards. Okay, so these are the general questions that we're interested in, and we have a specific application that builds on this candidate debate. So this is a pilot. It was a randomized controlled trial. It has all the characteristics of donor funded. It was very tightly controlled, like super expensive in a way. And but it works. So let me show you what that pilot looked like. And so we're going to be looking at Sierra Leone in West Africa. So the pilot was done around the 2012 elections. And the question is, as you come to the next elections, which were 6 years later in 2018, can you transition from this pilot to a large scale intervention? So let me just first show you what the pilot was, just to fix ideas. So these are debates between candidates from different political parties for parliamentary elections, right? So you can think about, these are small geographic jurisdictions. It's first past the poll. So whoever gets the most votes represents that constituency in national parliament. There's two major political parties in Sierra Leone. So this is a still from one of the debates. So the gentleman in green is one of the two major parties. The gentleman in red is a candidate for the other major political party. The guy second from the right is a civil society moderator that facilitated these debates. And then the gentleman in orange is a third party candidate. That party was really kind of a splinter of the Green Party and is sort of defunct now. But so what these debates look like was the moderator would pose a series of questions, right? So they're very civil, they're policy oriented, they're about kind of your technical competence and what you plan to do. So for example, the moderator would explain there's this constituency development fund that elected MPs get, like it's into their personal bank account. There's very little monitoring of it. And they'd say, okay, this is, 14 million leones, like $11,000. How would you spend it if you're elected, right? So voters are learning a lot. They're learning how much money is there. They're learning the MP is going to control the money and what the MP is promising to do with it if elected. Okay, so these debates were videotaped. And so how the debates got out to the kind of general voting public was through a roadshow. And so it's literally a roadshow. So the second picture on the right is somebody loading equipment into a truck, right? So the truck has a generator, a sound system, a projector, and the truck travels around to relatively rural communities and projects the debate on the side of the polling center in the evening. So you can think about, on average, like 200 people in a small community gather around, watch the debate, goes on for about 45 minutes, and it's a pretty rich experience. So this was done as sort of a three-tiered field experiment. So some things to note about it. First, there was only 14 constituencies. So there's 132 constituencies nationwide. So in terms of being a pilot at small scale, you're not operating a lot of constituencies at once, right? So you can think about trying to scale up to cover the whole country. You still have a pretty tight electoral calendar, right? Because there's a defined campaign period. You got to do all of this in about 6 weeks, right? So that you can think about some capacity constraints. This was very well received by the political parties. So we had a lot of buy-in from the parties. So the candidates from the parties were participating in these debates. High level buy-in from government. So the National Electoral Commission was involved in this and made statements at the end of this electoral period, like, we're going to make debates mandatory for all levels of election and all candidates in the next election, right? So the question is that going to happen, right? So thinking about, okay, who has incentives to actually make this happen and who doesn't, right? And that's what this new study is following up. So the new study has questions in kind of two big buckets. So the first is, why doesn't this just naturally scale up, right? So we had very rigorous evidence. So I should tell you that the evidence was, so voters learned a lot from these debates. They changed their vote choices towards higher quality candidates. The candidates responded to these big information shocks by investing more during their campaign in these kind of newly informed communities. So more in-person visits, more kind of campaign activity going on. And then over the longer run, we kind of followed the elected parliamentarians over the next 2 years, and we audited their expenditures under this constituency development fund that I mentioned. And the ones who participated in debates as candidates and had about a quarter of their electorate informed about their commitments, actually, we can verify much more of that money being spent on development projects on the ground, right? So not evaporating into other use cases, right? So good for voters, good for accountability. Okay, so why does the NOSCR just kind of scale up without sort of external intervention? Well, I think the kind of most obvious one is that you can imagine that candidates don't have very strong incentives to participate in something that is going to create electoral accountability pressure on them should they win an election, right? So we can think about, first thing we want to do is, what are the sort of political economy considerations that are shaping whether candidates want to participate in something like this at scale? Second thing we can think about is the voters. So that roadshow, super effective, but very expensive. And it's just simply not feasible to send a truck to every rural community in Sierra Leone in an electoral calendar. It's just not going to happen. So are voters willing to pay some travel costs or some ordeal costs? Like, are they willing to walk 45 minutes to go watch a debate in a bigger town, right? So is that going to be a constraint? Because if they're not willing to do it, it's going to be hard to reach them. And then when we think about financial sustainability, like, what is going on in the private sector media in Sierra Leone that could potentially play a role here in terms of extending dissemination, right? So we're going to look at radio stations, and we're going to look at private sector cinema halls. So radio stations, these are community-based radios, so they have a relatively small listener catchment area, so they kind of match up with these political constituencies. So can they play a role in encouraging candidates to kind of participate in these debates? And then the cinema halls, you can think about, these are relatively informal private establishments that their main business is showing Premier League football, soccer, and charging admission, right? So they charge people admission. They're all over the country. Could charging admission to a debate be part of their business model, right? Is that something that could help? Because if so, that's a really cheap way to get this out. Okay, so that's the sort of scaling side. The second question is, if you're successful in scaling this up, can we expect similar results to obtain at scale, right? So this, Angus Deaton and his co-authors have written a lot about sort of criticizing, pilots in development economics and randomized control trials in particular, and kind of articulating a lot of reasons why you might not get the same results at scale as you get in these demonstration pilots, right? And if those reasons kind of hold in a given context, you might be worried about making policy, public policy, based on small scale experiments, right? So we want to actually look at that in this context. Can you get something similar at scale when you're trying to extend the reach and lower the cost of this endeavor? Okay, so we are going to evaluate these questions in the context of a truly nationwide field experiment. So this is in the subsequent election. So there's 132 parliamentary races, and all of them are involved in sort of different phases of the research. So I'll give you just like a bird's eye view of what the research design looks like, but because we're trying to answer a bunch of different questions, the overall design is a little bit complex. So I'll just show you what it looks like, and then we'll kind of just take it in segments and go through the details of each one. Okay, should I pause for a minute here or just keep cranking?
If anyone has a question, they can ask you.
Yeah, I'm happy for people to interrupt.
Not all of us are economists, so we sit patiently. That's our culture. But I had one that, yeah, so when you said that there was a strong connection to accountability and you see development projects, that are actually on the ground, that presumably that candidates had promised they would. Can you tell us just a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's great.
And what the delta is for before and
oh, that's perfect. Yeah. So if you think about so this is randomized at the level of a constituency. So 14 that were randomized into treatment had the debates, and about a quarter of the electorate was informed. There's this video lingering with the candidate promising to do all this stuff. There was another 14 that were just randomized into the control group, which was just totally politics as usual. We didn't do anything there. So then 2 years later, we've got 28 members of parliament. They've all been given the same amount of money. So it's about $11,000 a year to spend on local development projects. You can also spend it on like facilitating your transport meetings with constituents and stuff like that. But, you know, there's a lot of money to spend on meetings, right? So what we did was we audited all 28 members of parliament over all their expenditures for their first 18 months in office. So in the control group, we could only verify about 1/3 of this money tied to any concrete projects on the ground. That goes up like almost 2 times, 2.5 times even in the treatment group, right? So you can just account for much more of they've got the same budget envelope and you can track the money to physical projects on the ground.
So there's good evidence it works.
Yeah.
It seems to.
Yes, exactly.
I'm wondering about the electoral environment, especially vote buying and clientelism. If parties typically rely on, you know, mobilizing certain segments of their base through clientelism, and if so, if these debates could actually just allow politicians to mobilize using club goods or you know, so development projects, but those that will serve a particular constituency to guarantee their vote.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's very common. So, so vote buying has like a very pejorative tone, right? Another way to think about a lot of what's going on is like campaign activity. So we capture data on both, right? So we capture in-person visits, like rallies. We also transfers like t-shirts, posters, food, but also cash, right? It's just like, what did you get from the candidate? And what did you get from all these different candidates? And so that we collect that information for voters. So what we saw was that the candidates were really doubling down all of those activities in the communities that became informed, right? So it's sort of an endogenous response to the experiment. So we did this big shock, big information shock on the voter side. And then we know it's a big shock because the candidates responded and started campaigning a lot more. Now, I mean, the elections are very well run. So they are private. It is like free and fair. They declared free and fair by local observers and international observers. So from my perspective, this is a sign that candidates are taking these communities more seriously. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Well, I guess now we're turning this into an econ style seminar. Okay, lots of questions. So I have like I'm like wondering a little bit about like the interpretation of these like findings, so like the normative implications. Right?
Yeah.
So I think, if I remember correctly, the 2 big findings are like you have kind of like more spending on these development projects in the communities.
Yep.
But I guess my question here is like, what kind of projects are these, and are they actually good for like the community as a whole, or are they like just avenues for these politicians to engage in either some symbolic actions or corruption? And then I think the other finding that you mentioned was that there's more support for richer candidates.
No.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, so there's 3 findings. One, when you talk to voters, they have much better information. So voters can actually tell you, here are the candidates, here's where the candidates stand on particular policy issues. Here, for example, here's what this candidate says is the most important priority for public spending, you know, health, education, whatever. Here's what the candidates say they're going to do with this constituency facilitation fund, right? So the voters know that. The second one is their votes are moving towards candidates who perform better during the debates. So the better is defined by independent experts who are watching all these videos and scoring the candidates on their quality of the discourse and policy and stuff like that. So those I think are kind of unambiguous. The campaigning is ambiguous, I think, right? So you're seeing more campaign activity in these communities. I don't think there's a clear welfare sign on that, right? The accountability, I think, is unambiguously positive in a welfare sense because you're having money that is spent on development. Just think about small scale public infrastructure, like I repaired a school or I built a latrine or I fixed a road. That's the kind of stuff that we're looking at. And the alternative is that money has been deposited in the candidates or the parliamentarian's bank account and is otherwise unaccounted for. So yeah. Okay, so let me show you this design and then we can keep talking about the different pieces as we go. Okay, so the scale up design is trying to do all these different things. So first we're going to look at, can we measure how willing candidates are to supply information, right? So we're going to take 72 of these constituencies and we're going to contact all the candidates there. And we're going to say this, this media civil society partner that did these debates last time has actually raised some money to scale this up. Are you interested? And then coming to your constituency and hosting a debate there, right? So do you want to participate in this, right? So we're going to be able to look at that. Then we're going to be able to see, okay, I'll just tell you, we're going to see that candidate willingness to supply information is on the low side. So it's like, can we get radio stations to kind of help corral candidates into debates and disseminate? So that's the first chunk. The second chunk, so we're going to have a experiment at scale covering 90 constituencies. So we're going to have 45 debates in the scale up. And inside those debates, we're going to measure voter willingness to pay to access information. And then we're going to look at these cinema halls and is there a role for them in disseminating this information at very low cost? And then we're surveying all the voters again on election day, so that bottom sample will be able to see when we extend the reach and lower the cost, do we get similar impacts on voters and campaign activity and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's just start at the top with this, like, are candidates willing to supply information? So let me just tell you really quickly. So if you're not familiar with Sierra Leone, it is how I characterize like low income, low information, low government accountability is pretty accurate description. For example, in 2018, your average registered voter has only about 6.5 years of schooling, and over a third of them have zero formal education, right? So there's been a big investment in the last 20 years in education, but most of these voters are older than that and didn't have the opportunity to go to school. And, they don't know a lot about government, right? So it's hard for voters to articulate what are the roles and responsibilities of a parliamentarian, for example, right? So this is who they're voting on. And then the government, by all these, kind of standard World Bank donor rankings, is just pretty low performing government. Okay, so I already went through this, but the results of the pilot were strong. So voters have impacts on voters, candidates, and the accountability of elected officials. It's not just Sierra Leone. So there was randomized controlled trials of similar debates in other countries, Uganda, Ghana, Liberia. So in the general neighborhood, that also seemed pretty effective. So it's not something quirky about Sierra Leone and debates. They seem to kind of travel to relatively similar contexts. And so, why did the National Electoral Commission not actually achieve its sort of stated ambition to scale these things up everywhere? Okay, so this is the first, and I think kind of most intuitive reason why this maybe wouldn't scale up organically, is that candidates don't necessarily have strong incentives to participate. So in these 72 constituencies, we called all the candidates, so the major party and the minor party candidates, and said this message, like, this NGO has these resources scaled up. Do you want the debate to come? So, most agreed to talk to us. But when they said, yeah, I'd love to be in a debate, we said, okay, here's the number of the NGO, call them and tell them you want to enter your constituency into consideration, right? And that's a really big drop off. So now we only have about 1 in 4 candidates, making that very small cost of just making a phone call to say, yes, I'm interested. Right, so that's a first pretty clear indication that there's some challenges on the candidate side. So there's some, I think, intuitive heterogeneity in these callback rates. So namely, candidates that are participating in a more competitive election. So these are sort of regions that have kind of strong representation of both of these kind of historic parties. And minor party candidates are much more interested in participating in these debates than the kind of dominant major party candidates. Okay, but so it gets worse. So when the candidates called the second number, then it was like, okay, perfect. Glad to hear of your interest. Now coordinate with some of the other party candidates in your constituency and call us back with like a date and a location where you guys will be willing and want to come together and have this debate. Right. So now we're only down to like fewer than 10%, right, of candidates were able to overcome this challenge. So it's kind of interesting because if you look at, at least one person expressing interest was covering about 54 races, which is pretty good. But now when you need somebody like calling back and saying, yeah, we're all on board, we're down to only 24 races. And I think there's a kind of interesting thing here is what happened to the 30 that were lost from step 3 to step 4. And there's kind of just to characterize it, there's sort of two things. So most of that is what I'm going to call persuasion failure. So there's only ever one candidate who called and said, yes, I'm interested. And that candidate was not able to persuade anybody else to join. There's only about 20% where you actually had multiple candidates calling in independently, and they couldn't kind of find and coordinate with each other in a way. So I think most of this is just there wasn't a lot of interest. Yeah.
Did you consider the NGO playing a coordinating role? You're placing the burden on politicians to self-organize.
Oh, so that's the idea.
Yeah.
So if you take the NGO out, is there any way that the party, like political parties, are just going to solve this problem themselves, right?
Yeah. But I'm not at all surprised by the result.
Yeah.
Having done this stuff in a lot of developing countries.
Yeah.
And I guess if I were designing something like this, I know what you're getting at.
Yeah.
On what's the real local uptake. Yeah. But I just can't imagine it being done without a local NGO actually coordinating.
Yeah. So let me pause on that for a second, because that's where now that we see how just kind of in the wild, this is really not going to happen. We're going to intervene and see what would it take to shift the incentives here, and that's the kind of positive half of the story. Yeah.
Did you see the incumbents from the 2020 election more willing to participate?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's not a lot of them. So there was 14, and we stratified half into treatment, half into control. But there's a lot of turnover too. So incumbents, only about a quarter of them run for re-election. So if you think we're 7 down to, we just don't have very many in the sample. I can look at that because we can look at it just at the constituency level, because they have inherited experience, even if they personally weren't involved, they might have seen it. We can definitely look at that. I haven't
the only reason is because if you have the intervention, then you don't have to worry about it in the future because people see the value of it. Yeah. The constituents for the incumbents.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can look at the kind of learning by doing effects for those kind of yeah. We haven't done that yet. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, would it not work much better if you have a neutral person, NGO or whatever, inviting one party and then telling the other party, okay, that this will take place? Oh. Because that's the same thing in our elections, The whole thing works by competition.
Yeah, okay, so good. You're setting me up perfectly for my next slide. No, you got it. That's exactly what we did. That's exactly what we did. So the question is, how do wealthier countries do this? Right? Because the debates happen all the time, right? There's a long history of debates in all kinds of rich countries all over the place. So they have a commission. The commission negotiates coordination across the political parties, and then the media kind of commits to disseminate it. So like in the US, the media could be like private CNN, or it could be like public broadcasting system, right? And they televise it out. So what's what we're saying? So there isn't this kind of big, deep media presence in Sierra Leone, but is there something comparable that could serve this role, right? And so what we're interested in is these community radio stations, right? So what we did was we said to these community radio stations, basically, we'll give you $200 if you get at least one candidate into your studio for a live on-air debate, right? So what does this do? And it's exactly what you just said. It does 2 things. It delegates coordination to an independent player, media player, and it introduces this competitive threat. Because now if the radio station says, I'm going forward with the debate, so long as at least one candidate is in the studio, now the debate's happening. It's free airtime for that candidate. Now the other candidates are worried that they're going to be at a competitive disadvantage if they don't show up, right? So can you kind of recreate this in this setting? And so we have, we've got about only, 10% coordination here, guarantee the platform. So we did this in 20 constituencies where the radio is very contiguous with the constituency. And what do you get? You get 70% now having a debate with 2 or more candidates. Having any debate is even better. So if you it's not really a debate if only one candidate shows up, but there's only 2 that didn't have at least one candidate in the studio for an on-air debate. And so 70% of them had more than one candidate, right? So I think this is the kind of the positive, the optimistic part is candidates on their own do not have very good incentives to do this, but it's a pretty easy, as in cost-effective, relatively technologically straightforward fix. So candidates, their willingness is low, but it's highly responsive to a guaranteed public platform. So yeah, so that's kind of just to sum up on the supply side before we go to voters. I think it's clear that the supply side is a challenge just because of the incentive structure. But it's one that's pretty easy to fix, right? So if you can get these kind of media players on board with doing this, the candidates will follow, basically. So we had research assistants listen to these debates, and they sounded pretty civil. So it's not like the radio stations went kind of off and did something not constructive. We can't say, the previous study shows that voters respond very strongly to video debates. We don't have the exact counterfactual to do voters respond to radio debates. But I think if you put all these pieces of evidence together, it's clear that supply side is a challenge, but it seems one that's pretty amenable to kind of low tech solutions. Okay, so let me go to voters next. Okay, so what we're interested in with voters is, if you can't send a truck to every community, can you get community members to travel to, a more central location to access the information? So there's, some studies, like for example, this study is in public health, that's sort of suggesting, these are very poor people, right? And their willingness to pay might be pretty low. So what we did was, now we're in the scale up branch. So of these treated constituencies that had the debates between candidates, so there's 45 of these. What we did was we took the DVD of the debate and took it to like the cinema hall, and we said, we're gonna sponsor voters to come. So we're gonna pay you for 80 tickets, and we're gonna distribute the tickets. Will you just play it once? And we'll see, will voters basically incur the travel cost, right? So then to distribute the tickets, we basically just went further and further and further away physically from the cinema hall. Right, and what were the data? So we've got 156 communities where 20 tickets were dropped. It's like an admit one ticket. And what we're doing is we're just tracking take-up rates from further and further away, right? Just to see, are voters willing to go if it's right on top of them? Are they willing to travel? Are they willing to walk or pay for public transport? So what we're going to look at, I'm going to show you just redemption rates. So what you see here is, we're going from 0 to like 8 miles away from the center. The fitted blue line shows you, at basically 0 distance, like right on top, where it's just giving you a ticket to walk to somewhere else in your town, you're getting like close to like 60% redemption rates. And it steeply tails off as you get a little bit further away, but it remains pretty strong over a pretty far distance, right? So if you look at 2 miles, you've got like around 30% of these tickets turning back in, right? That means people are willing to walk 45 minutes or pay for public transport to go and access this. So actually, the data goes out to 12 miles, and there's no redemption from 9 miles and out. But even at 8 miles, you're getting some proportion of voters that are willing to endure ordeal costs or private transport costs, right? So I think this is encouraging. So on the voter side, their willingness to pay for information doesn't seem like that's going to be a big constraint in trying to, get this to a truly national intervention. So now I want to come to this question. So now we've got these private sector cinema halls. This is super cheap. If voters will walk to the cinema halls, then you don't have to pay for a truck and a generator and whatever else. So the question is, are the cinema halls going to find it worth their while to play these debates and charge voters admission fees? So what we did was, the deal with the cinema hall was just to play it for that one sponsored screening. And then we said, you could just keep the DVD, it's fine. And then what we did was we found someone in the community that had basically a smartphone and WhatsApp, and asked them, will you just take a picture of the roster of the cinema hall every night for the next 5 days? And we just want to know, did they ever play the debate again? Right? Because there's no commitment or expectation, or there's no compensation for doing this. But if they feel like people are going to pay for it, they might have done that, right? And then we said, if you see it on there, go and do a quick head count of how many people showed up, so we have an idea about this. So this is what happened. So I think this is quite interesting. So the first column is just the subsidized screening, that one that I told you where we're passing out tickets. So all of them did it at least once. And, they got about, even that first screening, about 23 subsidized voters, and they got about another 40 people who just showed up anyway, who didn't have a ticket, but were interested in the debate. More interesting is the second column. That shows you on average how many more times did the cinema hall play the debate in the absence of any compensation. And so on average, they paid it 2 more times. They're charging their standard ticket price that they charge for Premier Leagues. They're getting a lot of voters. So this 220 is divided by 2.2. So on average, they're getting about 100 people to come in and pay this ticket price to watch the debate, right? So I think if you look at between the subsidized screening and the unsubsidized screening, this is exposing like 11,000 voters at very low marginal cost, right? So I think if we put this sort of the demand side together, I think there's kind of a few key messages. One is voters are willing to pay to access information. And then this kind of revealed preference data from the cinema hall suggests that this could be compatible with their kind of for-profit local media market. And I think that combination, so if you think about just our subsidizing voters, that's a cost of 83 cents per person to be exposed to the debate. So that's a pretty reasonable cost. If you go through the cinema hall, you're putting the cost onto voters, but they're only paying 24 cents to watch it. So that's super low cost. And so this combination suggests that this private sector dissemination could be a tool in really extending the reach at extremely low cost. So I think this is quite optimistic, but there's one big caveat, is that this is potentially solving the dissemination problem, but is unlikely to solve the production problem, right? Because to make the debate in the first place, the video, it's about $6,000, right? It's unlikely that these cinema halls have the kind of economies of scale to get into the production business. But I think in a sense, that's fine. So if you think about where should for donor external funds be allocated in this kind of thing, there's probably a big return to subsidizing the production of the video. But if you're going to do that, why not really extend the reach by bringing in private sector players and let them do part of the work for you, right? To get the message out. Okay, let me pause there because we'll go to the second set of questions, which is about scale up after this.
I have a really brief factual question. Is the cinema hall air conditioned? And at what time of day did you play the debate? They're not air conditioned, they're kind of open air. So they have like a roof on them and they have a generator, but they're open. The subsidized debate was in the evening. I'm not sure what time the other debates were. Okay, so let's keep going. Can I ask you one? Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Do you know if it led to higher voter turnout as well?
Oh,
looking at accountability as opposed to participation.
So no, it does not, but the voter turnout is exceptionally high in this context. So one thing I think that's a really good point. So the parliamentary elections happen on the same day as the presidential elections and the local elections. So turnout is not mandatory, but this is over 87% in this election, which I think is driven by the presidential race, but they're going. So there was no impact on turnout, but you wouldn't have expected. Yeah. Okay. So the second big question is just, okay, now that we're trying to blast these out and do 45 of them at once in the 6-week period, is that like, can we expect similar results at scale? And so this is a nice paper by this kind of education intervention in India that went through various pilots and trying to get scaled up by government. And this is a summary paper. They kind of identify 6 big buckets of things that might be different at scale than they are in a demonstration project. So the first is like general equilibrium effects, like displacement effects. The second one is spillovers. The third one is political reaction. So we've already talked a lot about the politics of this in the first part, so kind of not talk about that now, but we can say something about everything else except context dependent. So site selection bias. So in our context, that original pilot, we were targeting what we thought would be the most competitive elections. Ex post, it didn't end up being all that competitive, but now we're not. Now it's all elections. So even deep in the strongholds where one party is sort of guaranteed to win. And then piloting bias is like this voltage drop. So as you extend reach and lower cost, are you kind of diluting what you're doing to a point that it's ineffective? Okay, so we're gonna try to say something about each of those in the design. Okay, so just to show you the details of this. So we saw this kind of the randomization is at the constituency level. Then inside each constituency, we're picking 4 voter registration centers. So this is where voters register and eventually vote. So think about it as a polling center, where we're going to be interviewing voters on and around election day. So what we're doing is, first, there's the kind of the image with the flag is we're selecting the headquarter town for each constituency. So this is like the administrative headquarters. It has like, you know, that's where the higher level health clinic would be, and the secondary school and all of this. And so they all have, it's the biggest town in the constituency. So in the both control and treatment constituencies, we're going to survey people there, right? So it's like center of activity. And then we're randomly selecting other 3 more voter registration centers, just from kind of middle of the distribution of size. So it's 25th to 75th percentile, just kind of average sized communities. And so in the control constituencies, we're not doing anything but just surveying people right after the election to see, you know, did they see the debate? How did they vote? This kind of thing. But in the treatment constituencies, the debate is filmed, and then we're experimenting with lower and lower cost dissemination mechanisms. So that first one that says film screen, that's basically just doing what we did in 2012, but at scale. So now you just got to do a whole lot of them. The blast screen is we're going to do something similar, but it's in the big town. It's in the big headquarter town, and you're just hoping if I blast it there, you can get a lot more people exposed than having to travel to the rural communities. The mobilization, we're not showing anything, but we're giving voters information about where they could go and see the debate, right? So where the film screen is and the blast screen. So you're not actually doing the debate, you're just seeing, can you get people to go? And then the last one is a within treatment control, which is explicitly testing spillover effects, right? So if this is getting out through the ether because everybody's talking about it, that would be great for the efficacy of scale. It would lead to an underestimate of the effects, but in a way, you'd be happy about that. Okay, so I think there's a couple things to note just about sort of participation rates compared to the pilot. So 44 of the 45 scheduled debates were held, so that's good. So there's only one place where it didn't happen. But you can see, I'm showing you in terms of the 2012, you can see like opted in. So the APC, SLPP, those are the major party candidates. So in 14 debates, there's only one of those 28 candidates didn't show up, right? So one APC candidate out of 14 didn't show up, everybody else did. So you see like those debates pretty much always had both major party candidates. When you go to 2018, that is not the case, right? So the APC now only about 2/3 of the candidates are actually participating in the debate. SLPP is about 80%, so that's pretty good. But when you put those numbers together, that means in only about half of the debates at scale did you have both major party candidates participating. So you can think about that's going to have some effects on what the impact of the debate is. Minor parties, there are more of them than there were in the previous election. So overall, we're going to have more people in a given debate than last time, but you have this kind of drop off of the major parties. Okay, so the second thing to think about is how many, if there in the pilot, there's a lot more effort to make sure all the voters are going and have access and all of this, which is all sort of taken out in the scale up. So the first thing to think about is what is the exposure on the voter side? So in 2012, when you come to election day, about 82% of the people in those communities had watched the debate, so direct exposure, and about 4% in control, so a little bit of spillovers. So this is going down a lot, right? So now you're getting 26% of people registered at the film screen. So that's a kind of apples to apples. So from 82% kind of dropping to 26%. The blast screen is working pretty well. So that's about 22%, very similar to the film screen. Mobilization is effective but it's only at getting like 6%, right? You're mobilizing 6% of voters. I mean, it's really cheap, but so it is working. This kind of the p-value in column 4 shows you that those numbers between treatment and control are strongly different from 0. The survey only, there's absolutely no impact. So on spillovers, not happening. So this idea that if you put it out there, it's just going to percolate through the ether and treat or expose voters is not happening in this context. Yeah.
That's a good. Is it not maybe an idea to make a differentiation between swing constituencies and I think constituencies where everybody knows, okay, 80% or 90% are anyway, you know, favor of this or that party. I mean, this
that's a really good point.
Difference, you know.
Yeah.
It would be attractive in swing constituencies or constituencies where the two parties are relatively close, Whereas if you, as in many parts of Africa, where you have these tribes or whatever, 90% is anyway clear. You know, it's clear that then the interest, I think, of the people living there is rather limited.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's very easy to do. We haven't done that. So to see our voters in more competitive races more interested in getting exposed. Yeah, that's great. That's good feedback. That's super easy to do.
Also, so 22% of the treated constituency seeing the film, or 22%. So, I mean, voters typically are in households, right? So in the average household will be 2, 3, 4 people. So
that's right.
If one of them goes, tell the other. So
that's right.
You reach more people than.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And let me just what we're doing here, for each polling center, we're just randomly selecting 6 registered voters registered at that center and talking to them. So they weren't in any way notified or incentivized or whatever. So in a way, that's a really good number. And your point is, if those people represent different households, so if they're talking to their household or friends or whatever, could be higher in the kind of indirect effects. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of one thing that's interesting. So I'm just showing candidate participation was a lot different at scale as it was in the pilot. And I think one thing that's sort of a supply meets demand interaction is that voters are much more likely to attend a debate if the dominant party candidate showed up for the debate, which kind of comes back to your point. In the strongholds, you want to go if your preferred candidate is there, right? So in the swing, we can look at that too, would be a different interaction. So it's just kind of thinking, I think it's interesting when when you think about what are the candidates doing and the voters are responding to what the candidates are doing. It's kind of a complicated coordination game in that sense. So this idea of piloting bias or a voltage drop. So some of the things we did not work out at scale. So, and I think this is just you're really running against some pretty severe capacity constraints. So for example, there were text messages sent out, and you can see in this first panel, they were pretty effective in reaching film screening and blast screening places, but they were really supposed to be targeting the mobilization villages, right? Because that's what you want to do. You just want to text people and see if they show up. And they were not targeting those villages at all. Even worse, the implementing partner was meant to deliver the audio of the debate to radio stations in the constituency, right? So that's a super low cost way to just blast it out to everybody. They just didn't do it at all. So that there's no impact on hearing a debate on the radio because they weren't played on the radio, right? So I don't know if this is academically interesting, but it's certainly very important for policy, right? When you're hitting up against capacity constraints in terms of what you can accomplish. Okay, so then let's just look at the actual effects on voters at scale. So in terms of voter learning, we actually have pretty similar effects. So what we're asking is these are in a standardized index that wraps up a bunch of different questions, but things like, what does the APC candidate say is the most important priority for public spending, right? Education, health, and basically can voters place candidates on their actual true positions. And so in 2018, that is 0.28 standard deviation units. That's a really big effect. In 2012, that was a pilot. In 2018, it's very similar, right? So you get 0.16, 0.15 in the actual blast screen. Not so much of an effect in mobilization or spillover, but those are pretty comparable numbers if you kind of also take into the account that these are intention to treat effects and the compliance is lower. So if you were to scale them up, the point estimates would actually be bigger in 2018. So I think that's encouraging. You can actually get this message out to voters and they learn useful stuff. Second thing is, does this information change their vote choice? So here, this is going back. So I mentioned this earlier. So in 2012, we see about a 3.5 percentage point increase in the candidates that these independent experts who watched all of these debates and scored everybody said performed better. So this is like a shifting votes towards higher quality. And that's from the official electoral returns data. So that's not survey data, it's just looking at the vote shares for those candidates at the polling center level. If you do that in 2018, we've got this is tiny, but I think this is a really hard test because there are very few voters that were exposed. So in 2012, about 25% of voters were exposed. In 2018, it's only about 8%, right? So you gotta be really powered up to detect something. An easier test statistically is just to look at what people said in the exit polls. So now I'm looking at stated votes. And here the point estimate is very vague, right? So it suggests almost a 13 percentage point increase in votes for these higher quality candidates, but it's super noisy. So I think this is something that we just want to dig into a little bit more. But it's not clear that this at scale, the information acquisition was translating into changes in vote choice. So that may not be something that worked at scale. Okay, quickly, I know I have to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. So when you look at candidates, so I remember it said that, you know, candidates were kind of campaigning more in the pilot in the communities that were exposed. So if you look at kind of apples to apples again, so I'm going to look at, you know, within the treated constituency for candidates who participate in debate, and I'm asking voters, like, did that candidate come? Did it give you anything? These are also indices. So we have almost the exact same point estimate in 2018 as 2012. So you had 0.1 standard deviation unit effect in 2012, and that's 0.09 in 2018. So for the candidates who opted in, they're behaving remarkably similar to the way they did in the pilot. But remember, not all the candidates opted in, right? So if you just look at voters, did it change the campaign behavior of non-participating candidates? That's going into 3. So I'm expanding the set of candidates to see the point estimate is falling, it's no longer significant. So the ones who aren't participating in the debates are also not responding to the information dissemination in terms of their campaign activity. So the one last thing I want to say about this is the strong effects in 2012, there's kind of observational equivalence between 2 things. One is that the candidates started working a lot harder when they knew that voters knew about them, so an increase in their total campaign activity, or they're just reallocating campaign activity from control communities to communities that were visited by the truck, right? So we couldn't test that from our pilot design, that was just beyond the scope of it, but we can test it here. So if we just look at all candidates in the 45 treatment constituencies versus all candidates in the 45 control constituencies, and just say what voters said they were doing, now we've got nothing. Right, so this is a hard test though, because remember, a lot of the candidates, even from column 3, weren't participating in the debate and weren't responding. So this is really kind of washing out across participating and not. But you can see, if we just take this at face value, it suggests that what we're seeing in the 2012 and 2018 is more of a zero-sum reallocation of effort than a net increase in effort by candidates. Right, so that's the kind of the flavor of like a general equilibrium effect that you can test at scale that you're not able to do in the pilot. Okay, how am I doing? Can I, it's 12:24, another 2 minutes or so? Yeah, sure. Okay, all right, so the last thing is, so this is where COVID meets research, right? So in 2020, we were getting our audits together to audit elected members of parliament and see if they, you know, spent more or less. And so that didn't happen. But what we had done earlier, so I can't tell you the effects on public spending accountability at scale. So that's just, and it's too late to go back now. But what we did do is, this is sort of a proxy, and it's not really accountability, it's more constituency engagement. But this happened about 8 weeks after the elections. NGO partner organized these constituency meetings between the elected members of parliament and voters, right? And we're just going to see if, you know, participating in the debate makes you more or less likely as a parliamentarian to come and meet with your voters, and also voters seeing a debate or not. Does that make you more or less interested in going and meeting your elected parliamentarian? So the big caveat is this is not comparable to the 2012 effects, but it's sort of an engagement proxy, a short run engagement proxy. And so a lot of people went to these. So, you know, roughly about 100 voters showed up for the meeting, and about half the MPs showed up. But what you can see is there is no treatment effect. If anything, all of these are negative, which suggests that like short run constituency engagement, the debates are probably substituting for that. So if you already gotten your message out to voters and voters have seen it, both voters and elected MPs are less likely to engage in the short run in additional constituency engagement. Okay, so let me just sum up, and then I'm happy to, we can just open it up, broader conversation. So I think the 2 questions about scaling political information campaigns, the one on the kind of organic scaling, I think we saw candidates have weak individual incentives to participate, but it's pretty easy to correct with kind of guaranteed public dissemination platforms. Voters seem to have a pretty high willingness to pay for information. And I think these, the private sector has a potentially interesting role to play in really extending the reach of dissemination at low cost. And then on this concern about should we be basing public policy on small scale pilots, I think this one is not too problematic in that regard. What do we learn? Well, we learn certainly political incentives really shape things at scale, right? In terms of candidates' willingness to participate, and voters kind of respond to that. But if you look at the candidates who did participate in the debates at scale behaved very similarly on the campaign trail, and voters learned very similar at very similar rates, kind of a question mark on whether that had any impact on voting. And then this final thing on the accountability proxies suggests that debates maybe substitute for short run constituency engagement. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah, Marcel.
Yeah, you told us that voters were much more likely to come to these debates and hearings and so on if their favorite candidate was there.
That's right.
You also showed us that there were 13% more likely to vote for the person who won the debate.
Yeah.
Is the person who wins the debate also their favorite person? So
that's a great. Okay. So what is the correlation between the expert ranking and the expected preferred candidate? Right. That is great.
These local cinemas, they show these football matches, and the people follow their team, so maybe they come with the same kind of mindset. They follow their favorite person and let them squash the opposition.
Yeah, so maybe no, that's great. I have not done that. That would be fascinating. That's very straightforward to do. Yeah, so are the experts picking the winners?
First of all, I thought this was really interesting and fascinating. So you're trying to talk about how we can scale up, from a very controlled experiment on a small scale, a few geographical localities to a nationwide kind of sample. And you might maybe call this something like geographic scale up. But I'm wondering to what extent we could also think about a temporal scale up. To what extent, if you did this for a few election cycles, if you would expect the same effects, because I could imagine that one reason why people go to these to watch these debates is because it's new. Right. It has never happened before. They've never seen something like this. And they watch it, and then either they get into disillusion or it becomes boring, and they don't want to do it again the next election. So I'm wondering to what extent you would expect these effects to be equally sizable in subsequent elections.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's actually, so it's definitely something that we were interested in, because you could think about a number of ways that this could unravel over time, right? So either voters lose interest, or they get disillusioned, or candidates kind of figure out how to game the system so they participate, but they don't say anything useful, and so there's no impact. I think we're definitely interested in that. I think it's actually, this is kind of cautiously optimistic in that regard, because second time out, voters are willing to do it, a lot of candidates are willing to do it. I think what we could do is try to do this sample. This kind of comes back to the sample is really small, but is there any learning by doing on the voter side in terms of turning out at the ones that also had debates in 2012? I haven't done that, but that's we could say something small about it in that regard. I think so I think temporal scaling is interesting. You can also think about scaling up levels of the election. So one thing that happened in this election that had never happened before, and we and our partners are not involved in this at all, was they actually managed to get all the presidential candidates to participate in a televised debate. There's every election one candidate has participated in a debate, but this was the first election that all the candidates, including the sitting president, participated in the debate. Sorry, not the sitting president, because he was stepping down, but the ruling party presidential candidate. And so I think that was super interesting, because there was a lot of candidates, I don't know, 7 or something, and they all participated in debate at the presidential level for the first time. But I thought that was pretty cool, because that's arguably the election that people care the most about. Oh, wow. Yeah.
I feel your pain on the radio side not working in your experiment, but it does make me wonder about the media landscape in Sierra Leone. over 20 years ago, I did supported listening groups, getting together and sitting around the radio. Radio was clearly the most effective way to reach out to rural areas. I'm wondering if that's still the case in this, era of social media.
Oh, social media. Okay, that's really good. So I can say two things I think are interesting on that regard. So radio is still very relevant in general. So one thing, like this is really low income. So smartphones and social media definitely are big, like in the capital and some of the big towns, but getting into rural areas, it's still not super high penetration of smartphones. So I think social media is definitely becoming more out. Like WhatsApp is becoming a very, very powerful communication tool between parties and their members in urban areas. The thing that's nice about radio, so radios are still very relevant for people that don't have access to that. The other thing that's nice about radios is their geographic boundaries kind of match up with these subnational elections, right? So like the TV debate between the presidential, there's only one national broadcasting system. There's only that one TV station. So they're interested in doing a debate between presidential candidates because that's relevant for the national market. But they're never going to be interested in doing a debate for constituency 127, right? Because there's just not enough people watching, right, at that level. So I think the radios are nice because they're still kind of at the scale that matches the political jurisdiction that's of interest for subnational races. And I don't think that's going to change because a national audience would not watch 132 different debates, right? So I think it'll be relevant and stay relevant. Right, in the back end.
Thank you. This is really interesting. My question is about the quality of the discussions among the candidates. Does that have any relevance? And in relation to that, does the larger political context and what these candidates are representing, does that have anything to do with this process and the outcome?
So I think it does, sort of in two senses. One, like, these are very civil, very structured, policy relevant debates, right? So this is not mudslinging. I've watched all of these debates, like they're very civil, they're very constructive debates. So other debates where people are, just bad mouthing their opponent are probably not very useful. So I think external validity, I'm talking about having a civil structured debate and what the impacts are. I think we can tell from the voter data that voters are learning policy positions. They could also learn things like who has the most education, who's an incumbent, what are their names, what do they promise to do. Those to me are all pretty useful things to learn from a debate. So I think the quality of the debate is definitely important in terms of the impacts on voter knowledge. And if you think about what is externally valid about this, you wouldn't expect this to travel to a different form of debate that's not about policy and it's not constructive. So I think it's very important.
What about the larger political context and political conflict within the nation? I'm not very familiar.
So I mean
the context, so I can't.
So this to sort of high level characterization, there are the two largest ethnic groups are historically associated with the two major political parties. So these parties were formed shortly after independence, which was 1961. In that decade, both those parties are formed. It's the same two parties now. So people are regionally sorted. So the All People's Congress is associated with the Temne ethnic group and other ethnic groups in the north, and Sierra Leone People's Party is historically associated with the Mende ethnic group and other ethnic groups in sort of the south and east. So that's a pretty stable and pretty equal constellation of voters and parties. Political power has transferred at the presidential level, I think 3 times. So there's a civil war that ended in 2002. So 2004 is like the new era of democracy. And the presidency has changed parties 3 times now, peacefully. The parties are not, the other thing to keep in mind is that parties are not particularly ideologically differentiated, right? So one party, for example, kind of associated with prioritizing education, the other more so with health, but when they're in power, they're both doing health and education. So there's not the kind of ideological conflict or social policy conflict, for example, that we have in the US that's mapped onto parties. So that's a lot of that sort of taken off.
That's a question. Is this a parliamentary system or a presidential system?
So it's called parliament, these elections, but it's direct vote for the president.
So that's why my question. So the election of a candidate in the constituency does not have an impact.
That's right.
It has just an impact on parliament, but not who's becoming number one in the country on the executive side.
That's right.
Yeah. It would be really helpful just to walk sort of through the costs and the benefits of this. I think at one point you mentioned that producing one of these videos costs $6,000.
Yeah.
And the benefit that you were actually able to measure was control over an $11,000 fund.
Yeah.
I know that there are other kinds of benefits as well that wouldn't be quantitative or qualitative sorts of things, like what a parliamentarian would actually vote for or do.
Yeah.
If they're like in India, they're anti-infection laws, so it doesn't even really matter what you do at the parliament. So I'm just wondering like how we should think about cost versus benefits for something like this.
So from that first study, because it was actually tracking expenditures over more than 1 year. If you just think about the recovered expenditures on development, that more than covers the cost of the video. I mean, so that's an easy one to do. That's not quantifying the impact of voters having knowledge of government, having knowledge of candidates, making good choices. I'm not sure how you would put a price tag on that. So I think the other way to think about it is, so this radio debate costs $200 to treat 40,000 people potentially, right? We don't have the impact. We can't say exactly how much does a radio debate affect voters as compared to a video debate, but even if it's like 1/10 of the efficacy, like that cost benefit calculation looks pretty favorable. Yeah. So I guess that's the way I would think about it.
I have a question. First of all, you've probably interacted with Jim Fishkin's deliberative democracy.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so it's actually moving here to CDDRL. It's Center on Deliberative Democracy now.
Okay. Yeah.
It'll be called the Deliberative Democracy Lab.
Okay. Cool.
Here at CDDRL, it'll move in July 1st.
Okay.
But anyway, I can put you in touch with them if you're interested. So you know what deliberative democracy is?
Yeah.
Like they give them the information and see if they change their minds. So he's done this all over the world. Sort of interesting. Anyway, it's related but not the same by any. This is an amazing study. I can't imagine how much it cost or how much effort and coordination was put in. Well, let me put it this way. I can only imagine. But I wanted to sort of, tunnel in a bit to the issue of the accountability function and how much you can actually directly, because that's how you started, right? Which was trying to enhance the robustness of accountability and get these politicians basically held to account. Yeah, presumably by first presenting a platform, which in a lot of countries, candidates that I've studied anyway in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, don't want to do. Right. Yeah. Because they don't want to be held to that. Right. Exactly. So you must have had to have gotten them to produce a platform, which in and of itself enhances the quality of democracy. Right. Yeah. So you're making them promise something and in exchange for your vote. Right. So can you say anything, about that? Is that a new thing in Sierra Leone? Is it in fact a positive externality that that the whole process may have created? And then how exactly do you measure? You said you told us a little bit about it, that you have people then basically you're measuring accountability by what they do with the $11,000 only, but not actually. You are seeing a difference in the development projects that go into regions where they activate.
We're basically seeing money translating a development project versus not.
I see. And it's of the 11,000 only.
Right. Okay. Over 2 years, so 22,000. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not new money that flows in for like.
Well, it's money that flows in as opposed to get spent on transport costs or the other.
I see.
So the money is transferred into the parliamentarian's personal bank account, and there's no formal monitoring or reporting about what happens to it after that.
But does it translate into how they vote in Parliament for certain sets of policies?
So that we did not. So that we looked at in the pilot, and we didn't have any impacts on their voting behavior in Parliament. But that's also because some of the things that we had asked them about didn't end up having relevant bills voted on. So, for example, one of the ones was how they would vote. There was a gender equity bill for like a 30% quota for women's representation in parliament that was tabled by the previous parliament. It was going to come up to vote. And so we made everyone, one of the debate questions was going on record with which way you would vote on that. And then they never brought it to a vote. It's still something that's still talked about now, maybe now, this year, they're going to do this gender equity. So it's a little bit hard to track that. Right. So the best thing we have is what did you say you're going to do? And did you spend it on development or did you take the money and do something else?
So you got a statement from them ahead of time of how they, or a budget of how they will spend their $11,000, and then they articulated that promise to voters.
Well, that was a question in the debate.
Okay.
What are you going to do if you're elected with this $11,000?
I see. Okay.
So to the extent that they produced a platform, they're on record, and voters know what they said. So I guess in that way we're creating a platform, but
that's a better measure actually of accountability than looking at their parliament, because you could also look at their parliamentary voting record, but there are a lot of things that could influence that.
That's right.
Aside from just the 11,000. Okay, so it's okay. I was trying to.
This is kind of the best measure we have that you can map to the individual's performance.
Although you could look at their parliamentary voting record too and then compare.
Yeah. Yeah, we did look at things like what was their attendance in parliament?
You did.
Yeah, but we didn't have any impacts on it.
All right, final question.
I have a clarification question. It's about so in the 2018 first batch of the 72.
Yeah.
You said he gave $200 to these radio stations to run these debates, and then these were filmed, and then this would be the cinemas.
No, sorry. Yeah, it gets confusing about how the arms interact. So the 72 constituencies, we called everybody and got the callback rates over all 72. Then we selected 20 of them where they were paid the radio. There was no video, and those were not in the treatment group of the scale up. That was the end of the road.
My question is, because you said it's 6,000 to do a video, but then I thought I understood that they were actually taking these radio station video debates and showing them into the
no. So two different. So
these videos coming from?
The videos are from the
video.
The NGO, the civil society implementing partner did the videos. The stations were separate. Yeah, sorry, that was not clear. So they're what we wanted was for the NGO videotape debates to give the audio track of the debate to the radio stations in the scale up, and that didn't happen. So that would have been super low cost way to reach a lot of people. But that didn't happen.
Well, thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you all.